Welcome, everybody. We have such a wonderful, very, very special guest today with us, Natalia Rachel, who is the author of this wonderful book. And we will talk about something that might feel a bit heavy to you, trauma. It's a trauma talk today, but it is so relevant in these times that we are in. How are you? Who are you? And how come you wrote this book and you're such an expert in this topic?
Thanks for having me. It's so wonderful to be here with you. So many questions all in one. So I'm Natalia Rachel, and I'm the author of Why Am I Like This? And I'm a therapist and a speaker, and also a trauma-informed culture consultant and trainer. And so across all of these different things, all of my work is about helping us understand how trauma decontextualizes through our experience, not only personally, but relationally and dynamically, and to build pathways to healing for not only ourselves, but each other, because we're all in this really messy, crazy world together. And trauma is a big part of why a lot of us find it so difficult here. And the reason I wrote the book is, again, complex, as is the nature of life and healing in general. But many people have been asking me to write a book for a really long time about my take on trauma and my life story, but I wasn't ready. But a couple of years ago, I felt like I was ready. And so the book spans 40 years of my life, right from my experiences growing up in a lot of trauma, a lot of physical and emotional abuse, through to mental health misdiagnosis and this awful physical illness that ravaged my body and stole over a decade of my life. So it shares all of those experiences, but more importantly, all of the keys that I discovered to healing. So I looked everywhere to heal, traveled all over the world, and I looked through every different lens imaginable because I just wanted to be here. My spirit's always been very strong. And I guess over many years of learning and working on myself, and then studying to become a therapist and training in many different modalities, it felt like my kaleidoscope came into view, and I all of a sudden could understand the nature of trauma, but more importantly, how we can begin to heal. And so this book is my kaleidoscope.
Really, really good. Like your condensed wisdom all in one.
I hope so. Yeah.
I feel it is. I connect it completely. What is trauma though? Like we talk about this, this buzzword often, but what is trauma? You put it so nicely. So please tell us the definition you always give.
My definition of trauma is that trauma is when a past experience of threat that's over is living and breathing inside us now, and it can affect us physically, mentally, emotionally, and relationally. And trauma is largely unconscious and felt. So it's somatic in nature, and it travels through relationships, dynamics, communities, cultures, and systems.
So to put it like, to give an example, it can be fears, it can be limiting beliefs, it can be felt threats that aren't there. Can you give some examples?
Sure. I think it's really important to, I guess, caveat it by saying not everything is trauma. So when we are worried about something or afraid of something, that's not necessarily trauma. But when the way we perceive, express, or relate is altered by an unconscious threat response, then it is trauma.
Like what? What is an unconscious threat response?
When we perceive something or someone is very dangerous, but it's not. So one of the things that happens with trauma is that when we're going through a very threatening experience, our nervous system will kick into survival gear. So we are designed to self-protect. And so these signals will be sent through us saying, danger, 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 something's wrong, you better protect yourself. Now, ideally, when the difficult or traumatic or threatening situation is over, those threat signals will turn off and we will feel all is well inside me and all is well in the world at large. And we can continue without all of those survival responses. what trauma actually is those survival responses staying in play when they're no longer needed. And so the way we perceive, express, and relate will be as a response to past threat when there is none in the present. So a lot of the triggering that happens inside us and with each other these days is actually old trauma expressing and being triggered in dynamic and leaking in dynamic. Does that explain it?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So my next question would be, but it's half, you answered it half. How do I know I'm traumatized and not, just having a bad day, or taking something out of context? How do I know I'm traumatized? And when does trauma happen usually? Like, what's the age? And you said it's mostly unconscious. It's mostly unconscious. So how do how do I know?
That's a really tough question. And often we need somebody to help us figure it out. So we heal through relationship, and we discern and we make sense through dynamics. We can't do it on our own. A really good way to tell, is this a present day trigger, or is it potentially past trauma, is to look at the, I guess, ratio or the dynamic between the experience in the present and the intensity of our experience. So if we are having a trauma response, commonly our emotional response or our trigger will seem out of proportion to what's going on in the present. What's really interesting is these days it can be really hard to tell, because so many of us are living in oppressive or disrespectful or downright harmful dynamics or systems. And so when that's happening, it can become near impossible to figure out, well, is this my trauma at play, or is something funky going on here? And often the case for those of us that have experienced past trauma is it's both. And being able to pull apart, what can I assign here to the present and what can I assign to the past, is really important for beginning to come out of what can feel like a very, very overwhelming and confusing experience. So what's from now and what's from the past? And I refer to this as a hybrid trigger. So when we're having a hybrid trigger, it's really hard to figure it out at all. In relation to your question, when are we traumatized? We can be traumatized at any point. When we are threatened by something, or when we do not have the resources to move through an experience, if we do not metabolize all of that, we will experience it as trauma. What else is really interesting is that we can go through really difficult experiences and traumatic experiences, but if we do have the resources to metabolize it, it won't be trauma. So the trauma is not about a past event or a past relationship itself. It's about what's left over inside us and how it fundamentally changes the way that we perceive, express, and relate. Now, we are more likely to have more, I guess, permanent, if anything's permanent, changes if we experience trauma in our early life, particularly within early life relationships. But it can occur at any point in our life.
Okay, how do we get out? How do we heal?
I mean,
and how do we not just, because being very, very curious about people's lives and having experienced my own stuff, it's very common that we go to psychotherapists, and I really appreciate your story that you talk about here, and this sitting with your psychotherapist and trying to get a gold star for being a good girl. And I can totally relate to that, and I assume a lot of people can do too. And it feels a lot that we have a support system that is coping and not healing. But the question is, so how do we heal? Like, how do we metabolize something that is unconscious? I know you said you need help. But also triggers, then they're not unconscious anymore, they become conscious, and also probably the results that you have over and over and over again. How can we use that in order to heal? And what's the result? First of all, can we jump at the end? What's the result if we're healed? Because why should I care?
I believe when we heal, essentially we have more capacity for aliveness and we have more compassion and empathy.
Yeah.
And ultimately a greater sense of internal peace.
Yeah.
And a sense of sovereignty and empowerment in the world. So these, to me, are the results of our healing work. So it's not about being some perfect, strong, shiny human. It's about feeling safe and peaceful and responsive and being able to move from a sense of power. And before we can get there, the first thing we have to do is learn to listen to the language of trauma and to be able to decode it and then respond to it. So understanding how trauma may be showing up inside our bodies, inside our minds, and most importantly, inside our relationships. And this is a piece that is often missed. That is key. Once we understand, then we can begin to bring down all of those survival mechanisms that at one time were keeping us safe, but end up becoming the blocks to what we're really craving, which in fact is each other. So one of the biggest things that happens when we are existing as a traumatized self is that we feel pretty alone and like we can't really connect. So that story in my book about, going to therapy and performing to get a gold star, we learn to exist like that. We learn how to cope and survive and relate in ways that feel safe and acceptable. And so it's really interesting when we begin to heal because we start to bring down, I guess, all of these coping mechanisms and fallacies. And it's a really messy process because we can then start to feel some of the things we've been running from, which is often deeply afraid, often a huge sense of shame for not being able to feel normal here. And then beneath those, what I call blocker emotions, fear and shame, beneath that, there is usually an epic amount of grief, a good load of rage, and a whole bunch of other stuff that we need to process along the way. Doesn't sound fun, does it?
Well, I mean, it isn't fun. It isn't fun, but as you said, the other end is what makes it so worth it, that you feel peace. So that's how I experienced it. Like, suddenly being able to show up as myself and not playing roles anymore and being totally drained at the end of the day, and I would love to, because this is a little story. When I got your book, I just open it. I kind of asked Spirit, one page that would really make my day. And bam, I just had before that I had a session with a client of mine, and she said, I'm really tired of myself, of playing myself. And I remembered when I started to heal, I had this feeling of being really hungover from my life and from myself and from playing, from all these gold star, lada. And you talk about acceptance in a way that, it's not really talked about. And when I read it, I was like, yes, took my Nordic walking sticks and just, yes. Can you tell us about your definition of acceptance and what it has to do with, doing the work or starting the work?
I mean, I hope I'm going to talk about the same thing that you found in the book. Let's see. But, a big part of my journey, there are two pieces to this for me, right? One is actually entering a deep state of compassion for your authentic and messy self. But there's another piece that I write about, which is actually about non-acceptance.
Yes, that's what I mean.
And that's what you're referring to. Yeah. And so for me, I couldn't heal until I decided, no, I'm done. I don't accept this life anymore. And for me, that was setting this boundary. And I now believe that all healing work comes back to boundaries. And so when I decided I'm done with this, I don't want to be sick of myself anymore. And I don't want this shitty life that I've got. then everything began to change. And it also snapped me into a very deep state of accountability.
Yeah.
And something that's really interesting when we have trauma is we lose both those things. We lose accountability because we're fundamentally disempowered when we are frozen in a state of trauma. We just can't. I can't change it. I can't. And that's the trauma. That's the neurophysiology of trauma at play inside us, saying you can't. You know, there's no way to change and to survive. And then the other thing we lose is compassion. So we feel sick of ourselves. You know, many of us end up hating ourselves and hating everybody else. And so I think two of the ingredients that we have to find to heal is this deep accountability and non-acceptance. I'm going to do whatever it takes to shift this, even if it's hard and even if it's painful. But then as well, the compassion to be able to care for ourselves through the process. And when we blend those two together, there will always be alchemy.
What is one way to care for ourselves?
The fundamental question that we can ask ourselves through the healing journey is, what would nourish me now?
Yeah.
What would help me feel a little safer in this moment? And it's really hard to shift to that as the constant inquiry, because most of us that have unresolved relational trauma or intergenerational trauma have this incredibly strong voice inside our heads that shames us and tells us that we're not worthy and we don't deserve any of the things that we want. And sometimes this voice is so manipulative that it will speak to us in ways where we think it's helping us. So something that we can do to look after ourselves is to, one, ask ourselves what would nourish us and help us feel safe, but also to watch out for that voice that will come again and again and again and try and block us from our healing. And what this is commonly called self-sabotage. That's what self-sabotage comes from, this voice.
Yeah, absolutely. The angel that it once was to protect us, but now is not working anymore in order to heal. What I love about your one paragraph, and I would love to read it out, if that's okay.
Sure. Yes.
Is you describe also, yes, that we have, self accountability, but what I understood from this book, and I experienced exactly the same, also to let go and let your body do what it needs to do. And this is, this is a very powerful passage. And I think it just gives a little bit of context what healing can feel like or look like. Yeah, may I?
Please.
Okay. There are many moments, page 130, by the way. There are many moments that I thought I was going to have a heart attack, or that my violent trembling would turn into a fatal seizure. But that new part of me, it's like she was watching over me with her warm hand on my shoulder, letting me know that I would be okay. I spent hours every day meditating, having warm baths, and sleeping. I also started having memories about my experiences of abuse. My trauma was coming up to be processed. I wanted to shut it all back down, but again, my conscious healing self told me that this was the pathway to a better reality, that this process was essential. So I went with it. I let my body have its experience for the first time in my life. I let it writhe, I let it contract, I let it sleep. I let it heave. I let it sob, wail, and scream. I held the space for my truth to emerge with no tactics to deny, avoid, or suppress it. No medication, no work, no distractions at all. I was present with myself. Over the course of 4 months, my body found equilibrium, homeostasis, peace. All my symptoms vanished, from the inflamed brain and spine to my bruised legs, to my fluid-filled lung, to my bloated lymph system, to my narrowed eyesight. I had been wearing 3 different pairs of prescription glasses for years, and all of a sudden, my vision was crystal clear.
It's so strange to hear you read it. Got goosebumps. No one's ever read me back a passage from my book before, so thank you.
It is, I mean, Your vision became crystal clear.
I mean, it was crazy. So just elaborating on my eyes, you know, my illness affected every part of my body. And so I was going to the eye doctor regularly, and I had glasses for long distance and for short distance. And then I had sunglasses, and they all had prescriptions because I couldn't see anything. And when I detoxed off the medication, actually it first got worse. And I started getting these huge swellings on my eyes. And I thought I was going blind. And there was a couple of times I had to go to the hospital because my eyes were completely puffed up and I couldn't open them. But I know sort of retrospectively that it was a form of discharge and healing crisis. And after those 4 months of really deep physical release and processing core memories, yeah, I could say I don't wear glasses now, which is just phenomenal, isn't it?
Yes.
Those
Yes,
months
it is.
were so intense. Those months were so intense. You know, talking about letting the body have its experience, we don't. You know, we hold so much. Think of all the times you want to like make a face at someone and you don't, and you just smile sweetly. That's just a very small example. We are very physical, animalistic, expressive beings, and over time, not just because of our trauma, but because of the way this world is structured and all these rules we've put in place, not only have we suppressed our trauma, but we've expressed our natural expressive nature. And something that happens once we do begin to let go of all those bracing patterns and that stored energy is that our bodies become more alive and expressive and open. And it's pretty beautiful.
It is. It is amazing. It is amazing. And I think we have to share, especially this part where people see, you know, you don't have to suffer. Like often I come because I had this too, like this breathing. I couldn't breathe for years. I couldn't breathe. And then when you can breathe, your whole life is different because you're not focused on, you know, can I breathe today? No, it's just, you know, you just, as you said, alive. And yes,
Something really interesting that happens with clients that are doing somatic work. So the not being able to breathe is really common when there is suppressed grief and suppressed fear. And so when we begin to let it out, it's really common, number one, for people to start coughing a lot, and it can feel like they're letting out dark black smoke from their lungs. And something else that's common when fear responses start to switch off is it can automatically feel like this huge inhalation. And something that I train the therapists that work with me to catch is this huge expansion of the lungs and life force and entering of new breath, because that in itself, if we don't know what it is, it can feel scary.
Yeah.
And if we don't hold that moment to transform the fear into just a state of aliveness, what can happen for a lot of people is they then snap back.
Yeah.
And that's the trauma paradox at play. But it is pretty beautiful when you can just breathe and be alive and not have to try or worry about one's aliveness.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not your schedule anymore. It's just your being.
Yeah.
Very nice. Oh, thank you so much, Natalia, for your work, for your incredible, yeah, also you, I mean, if you don't follow her on LinkedIn, I have you every morning with not only your comments and your rich, you know, your very rich posts, but also seeing other people, the way they engage and the way they are really, you know, doing the hero's work. Thank you.
I'm very humbled to see this kind of engagement with what I'm sharing, particularly on LinkedIn, because it's not typical of the content you would find there.
Yeah.
And I've only been doing this for a little over a year on LinkedIn. And just to see the level of engagement and people sharing their experiences and being curious and asking questions on a platform that's actually usually about building your brand, you know, to be talking about healing and life in such a vulnerable and authentic way it's humbling and it brings me a lot of hope for humanity.
Me too, yeah. And there's a big need. So thank you, Angel. Thank you for coming at this particular time. Where do we find you and your work? And how can we pick on your wisdom?
Thank you for asking. So, of course, LinkedIn, I post nearly every day in the morning in Singapore, which is very late at night in Europe, and also nighttime in America. And you can find out more about my content at nataliarachel.com. There's loads of free resources, articles, meditations, videos, all kinds of things. Next year, you can work with me in 3 different ways. So one is I'm running a 6-week course for people who are wanting to begin or continue their own healing work. It's online on Tuesday mornings in Singapore, so it'd be Monday nights in Europe. It's called the Illumination Process, and it actually draws on the content of the book. So my desire is to guide you through the process of unlocking that language of trauma so you can continue to heal. The second way that you can work with me is with my leadership training. So I believe once we get to a stage of our own healing work, we actually become the social impact that the world needs, and therefore we can become the most incredible leaders. So I've been running a leadership program called Trauma Informed Human. This year I launched it over in the States, and next year it will be the first opportunity to join my open program. It's going to be in Dubai, which is not very far on a plane from Europe, in late March. So I'd love to see some people coming from Europe there. And the last way that people can work with me is if they're therapists or coaches and they're interested in bringing a somatic approach to their clients. I have a professional development training called Trauma Informed Relational Somatics. And next year that will run both in Singapore and in America. So those are all the ways that you can learn with me.
And hopefully very soon in Europe too.
I hope so. Looking
I'm
for
sure.
a Europe partner. Shout out to anybody who would love to collaborate to bring my work over there.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the work, for being you. And this is going to be also, broadcasted over several platforms. If you have a friend that needs some support, that can benefit from this talk or from the resources Natalia puts out, please be so kind, tag them or send it right away. Thank you.
Thank you for
Much love
having
to
me.
Singapore.